with Gil Kalai on the statistical, computational, mathematical aspects of noisy, intermediate-sized quantum computers.
So I hope you hear me well. Thank you very much for the invitation to this inaugural IBM Research Informational Lens workshop. I know many of the speakers for many decades, and it's a pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, in this virtual way. So my talk, let me start with two background questions. The first question is, are quantum computers possible? This is a vastly important question. There are huge expectations for quantum computers, very large investment, huge implications and consequences, and it is a clear-cut major scientific question. Another question I would like to address is the recent year-old Google demonstration of quantum supremacy valid. And here I use the terminology used by Google, although I know that IBM, and to some extent also me, prefer the notion of quantum advantage, but these are equivalent. And this is a very important question. The quantum supremacy demonstration a year ago by a Google team was compared to the Wright Flyer in 1903, to the Enrico Fermi nuclear chain reaction in 1942, to the first vacuum tube digital computer, and to the recent discovery of the Higgs boson. And it is a major task to try to figure out if this result is correct. And this talk is mainly about statistical, mathematical, and computational questions, concepts, and ideas related to the study of these two questions. And we will concentrate, you can regard these as the most significant bits, but as mathematicians, we are very much interested in the less significant bits. And I will talk about several issues in statistics, mathematics, and computational complexity related to this question. Let me just explain the notions. NISQ computers, or noisy intermediate scale quantum computers, are simply noisy quantum circuits with at most a few hundred qubits. So this is what people in many groups over the world, including IBM, Google, and other places, both academic and industrial, are trying to build. And often scientists do not like the distinction between intermediate scale and large scale and these few hundred qubits. And there is a qualitative important difference between the NISQ regime and larger scale regime. And the difference is that in the intermediate scale regime, a single error causes the circuit to fail. While in larger regime, at least in principle, there are other possibilities. The Google experiment consists of a random quantum circuit which produces a sample of a few million 0-1 vectors of length 53. So there were altogether 53 qubits, and they ran certain random quantum program. And at the end, there was a sample. You can see here some the first vectors in this sample, and this sample represent in certain way a certain ideal probability distribution that would have been produced if there was no noise. And the two crucial claims were made. The first is that the estimator for the fidelity phi, and this is a statistical test how the noisy sample is correlated with the ideal distribution, satisfies that phi is bigger than 1/1000. And the second is that producing a sample with similar statistical property is beyond the reach for current supercomputers. And this consists of the quantum supremacy or quantum advantage proof. And the evidence for both these claims is indirect. and this was, in any case, this was the result. Before I go to talk about various mathematical and statistical things, let me give you briefly my answer to the two questions. As a matter of fact, the very brief answers is no. Are quantum computers possible? No. And is the Google demonstration of quantum supremacy valid? Also no. But let me offer a slightly more nuanced and detailed answer. So are quantum computers possible? In my view, it is a serious possibility that quantum computers are not possible, and this is what I expect and study. And about the Google demonstration, the Google claims are not convincing. There are serious concerns regarding their experiment. So my overall view can be seen from this cartoon for 2017. Ask about what about the efforts of Google, IBM, Microsoft, Intel, Alibaba, Rigetti, and so on and so forth, both groups in academia and in industry, to reach very stable qubits and demonstrate quantum supremacy. So the answer is that they will all fail. And for a quantum error correction for high quality encoded qubits, we should not expect even a false positive. And my lecture today consists of 12 snapshots. And for more, to get a coherent, I hope you will enjoy this tour in various statistical and mathematical issues. But for more, you can look at these papers. They are also in the abstract of this talk. And especially in the first paper, it's joint work with Yosi, Rinot, and Tomer Shoham on statistical aspect of the quantum supremacy demonstration. And before I start, let me make a request for IBM researchers. We would be very grateful to receive a sample from the IBM quantum computer together with simulation of the same circuit, with or without noise. I see I made a few last-minute corrections that were not, but I took the wrong file, but no, never mind. And in any case, we really, it is very helpful for us to have samples from the computer, from the quantum computer, along with simulation, either noiseless simulation or even simulation with noise of the same circuit. And we would be very thankful for such a data. We will be happy to collaborate or just to receive the link. Okay, so let's move to the issue. And the first thing I want to tell you about is the Porter-Thomas distribution. And this is a very nice mathematical idea, statistical idea. And the starting point is that the ideal quantum state of a quantum computer with n qubits is represented by a unit vector u1 up to um in an m-dimensional complex vector space. Here, capital M is 2 to the n, and little n is lowercase n is the number of qubits. The coordinate of u are referred to as amplitude. Measuring this state yields a single sample from a discrete probability distribution. With probabilities, W1 is the norm of, sorry, there is a typo here, the norm of U1 square, W2 is the norm of U2 square, and so on and so forth. Wm is the norm of Um square. And when U is a random unit vector, these probabilities are themselves distributed like exponential random variables. More precisely, they are discrete variables because of the fact that their sum of square is equal to 1. And the reason that they are exponential is sort of acute. A single coordinate for this real 2m dimensional space is distributed like Gaussian distribution, and the sum of two Gaussian distribution is very close to exponential distribution. So this is the Porter-Thomas distribution. This is a random unit vector, but if you take a quantum computer and run on it a random program, then you get something which statistically look very similar to this distribution, except in this distribution there are points, there are coordinates where the the probabilities are larger and some which are smaller, and the way the larger and smaller the mountains and valleys depend on the quantum circuit. And the whole point is that if that it's very difficult to simulate this dependence using a classical computer. So here you can see the Porter-Thomas probabilities adjusted to the fidelity level, the amount of noise that will come in a minute to, and how it is in the samples from the quantum computer of Google, how it's compared with the theory, and you see a very nice fit of these two distributions. Now I want to tell you the second snapshot, and this is called the size bias distribution. Suppose that you want to estimate the distribution D of the number of people in apartments. So you sample random people on the street, or if you think it's not a good sample, you find the perfect way to sample the population, and ask each one how many people share his apartment with him. Or ask each of them how many share the apartment. And the distribution of the answer, the distribution E of answers, will not be identical to D. A quick way to see this is based on the fact that people you meet on the street are not from empty apartments. So the new distribution E is biased toward the large value of the distribution D. And this is a very nice correspondence, and D is called the size bias distribution corresponding to C. And we face a similar situation in the Google experiment. In the Google experiment, what we can do is we can take every sample that we obtain, compute on this sample using classical simulation the probability to obtain this sample, and sum up for the sample this probability. And rather than get the original exponential, the original Porter-Thomas distribution, will get a size bias distribution. And here you can see the size bias probabilities, again adjusted to the fidelity level, and you can see that they perfectly agree. The distribution coming from the Google sample, which is here green, perfectly agree with the gamma distribution, which is what the theory tells you, which is here pink, and they match very nice. Okay, so now we want to come to a crucial question, is how to model the noise in noisy intermediate scale quantum systems. And recall that in this regime, the intermediate scale regime, a single error causes the circuit to fail. There are several caveats here when we talk what do we mean by error. In general, the error can be in measurement, it can represent inaccuracy in performing the gate, and the fidelity fee is the probability that not even a single error occurs. And the Google basic noise model is the following. NC of X, the noisy probability for X, is phi times the ideal probability plus 1 minus phi divided by M. So phi is the fidelity, and here X is a 0-1 bit string of length N. P, C of X, is the ideal probability, the probability that noiseless quantum circuit will yield X, and M is equal to 2 to the N. So in other words, the Google noise model is a mixture between the noisy distribution and the uniform distribution. So here you can see what we expect and what is sampled for this model. If we make if we sample according to the model and we compare it to the model itself, we get the picture on the right, which is fairly thin around the model. And on the left, you can see what we actually get for 12 qubits from the Google experiment. So here we see that there is not the match between the model and the empirical data is not so good. And this is a very interesting topic for further understanding. This can also be tested by the chi-square statistics on the distance between two distributions. Now I want to tell you the basic way to estimate the fidelity from the data. And as I said, the very clever statistical idea in the Google experiment. The Google experiment has a lot of aspects from various areas of science and technology, both from physics, from engineering, from statistics, from computational complexity, and it involves massive computing. And a very nice statistical idea is to use the following estimator: to look at the sample you obtain from the computer, and to sum the probabilities for the ideal computer, the probabilities you expect from the ideal computer on the samples, and sum it up, and I should say this should be divided by n. You take the average and subtract it by 1. And again, there is a typo here. You need to divide by n and then to subtract by 1. And this is an estimator for the fidelity. And overall, it is a good estimator. And the clever thing about it, that even if m, the dimension of the Hilbert space, is very large, let's say that you have 40 qubits and a billion dimensional Hilbert space, this estimate they expect to give good results as long as the fidelity is not too small. And overall, it is a good estimator. It does not depend on the specific noise model, but only on very basic properties shared, also with other models. And the crucial statistical philosophy, I already mentioned it, let me repeat. Once we use numerical simulation to compute a PC of xi, we can recover the size bias distribution and estimate the fidelity from relatively small samples. So to get an empirical distribution from scratch without simulating it before, we need very large samples, which are exponential in n, in the number of qubits. But if we use a classical simulation of the probabilities, we can recover the size bias distribution by relatively small samples. So one thing we did in our statistical study with Rinot and Shoham is we found that a very subtle but interesting statistical point, which is especially come to play for when the number of qubits is not large, is that the estimator, when we look at the specific realization of the Porter-Thomas distribution, then the estimator U is a biased estimator. And this also leads to a larger variance over all realizations. Not large, it should be larger. And we consider the MLE, maximum likelihood estimator, as well as certain variant V of U adjusted to the realization, which is unbiased. And here you can see our study about the quality, the relative quality of this estimator. So when the fidelity is small and the number of qubits is large, then their performance coincide. But this gives an interesting improvement in various regime for small number of qubits. Okay, so the next observation about the model is that the idea of mixing the ideal probability distribution with the uniform distribution is a naive model of noise. And a more realistic noise model would be that the noisy distribution is a mixture of the ideal distribution with a certain fluctuation of the uniform distribution. And this fluctuation of the uniform distribution is also depends on the circuit. And for part of the noise, so the noise which is caused by readout error, by measurement error, we can have a fairly good understanding of this fluctuation, at least under certain statistical assumptions that are made in the Google paper. And this gives us a sort of a secondary signal. If the main signal is the ideal probability distribution of a noiseless circuit, this secondary signal, which also have mountains and valleys, also is present and can be identified in the data and can also give a fairly good alternative estimation of the fidelity. So here, again, if you look at what we expect from the readout model minus the major model, which is the noiseless probabilities mixed with the uniform distribution, if we compare it to between the model and the data, we get a cloud which does not indicate much, but as it turns out, there is a certain correlation, and this correlation is also related to the fidelity and give you a fairly good alternative way to estimate the fidelity. Now, the next idea I want to describe is the connection with the Fourier analysis. And when we have P is a function where X takes the value of strings of length n of 0, 1 vectors. So P is a real function or probability distribution on bit strings of length n. Then we can express P as the sum of P hat of S, Ws of X, where Ws of X are what's called the Walsh-Fourier function. This is the Fourier decomposition of the function P. And describe in terms of the Fourier decomposition, the noise model used by Google is very simple. We leave the Fourier coefficient of the empty set as is, and we shrink all other coefficients by the fidelity phi, and for every non-zero element. A more realistic model, which also agrees with the readout model, is the heat kernel noise, where the noise shrinks exponentially according to the size, the support, or the size of S, where S is the index of the Fourier decomposition. So for the Fourier decomposition is a sum of the function with coefficient which correspond to every subset S of 1 up to n, and the heat kernel noise shrink the Fourier coefficient exponentially with the frequency or with the size of S. And this is this form of noise is extensively studied also in various areas of mathematics, also in my area in combinatorics, also in theoretical computer science, and it is related to the small set expansion and the maps from 2 norm to 4 norm that were mentioned in Aram. So now we are now working on developing statistical tools to understand the Fourier behavior of distributions based on sparse samples. So, of course, for a small number of qubits, like 12 qubits, we can try to estimate the individual Fourier coefficient since we have large enough a large enough sample. But the idea of size bias distribution seems to extend to the Fourier coefficient, and this may enable us to learn about the contribution of Fourier coefficients in various levels based on relatively small samples. I should say that the Fourier description seems relevant to seem valuable for understanding probability distribution for noisy intermediate scale quantum systems. And this study was initiated in my 2014 work with Gil Kalai on noisy boson sampling. And it is related to an even earlier work with Benjamin and Shoham on noise stability and noise sensitivity. As in fact, it also related to a statistical notion which is called the ANOVA decomposition. So now I want to tell you two insights from the idea. So here the idea, which already goes back to my work of Gil Kalai, although in the setting of boson sampling or bosonic systems, is that the heat kernel noise is a proper way to model noise. And what do we gain from it on the behavior of samples for noisy intermediate scale quantum computers? So the first insight is computational simplicity. For constant noise level, the computational power of noisy intermediate scale quantum system is very limited. So here is a picture of computational complexity classes, and you can see P correspond to polynomial algorithm, and P is surrounded by NP, which is the NP class, and this is out of scale, but you see NP is part of a whole hierarchy, and PH corresponds to the entire polynomial hierarchy. What quantum computer can do, which I denote here by Q, includes P. It does not contain NP, but it extends even beyond the polynomial hierarchy. And now inside P, there is an important computational class, very, very primitive computational class, which is called bounded depth computation. And inside this class, Guy Kindler and I, we identified an even smaller class, which is a probability distribution, which can be approximated by low degree polynomial, bounded degree polynomial. And this very primitive class, actually, it has some interesting connection with learnability and with learning, contain, so the computational power of noisy intermediate scale quantum system, when the noise level is constant, is included in this class. So it's a very, very low level computation. There is another insight which comes from the Fourier approach of noisy intermediate scale quantum system, and it is that the noisy distributions are non-stationary or chaotic, if you will. So for a wide range of sub-constant noise levels, the outcomes will have vanishing correlation with the ideal distribution. Moreover, we can expect that the outcome will represent chaotic, non-stationary probability distribution. So if you will run the same circuit twice, you take a 12-qubit circuit or a 15-qubit circuit, you run the same circuit twice, you will get poor correlation between these two runs. And if you analyze according to the Fourier distribution, you will realize that the high frequencies, the correlation is vanishing. So this is an insight. And okay, here is a schematic description what we can expect from the complexity of quantum systems or behavior of noisy quantum systems. Let me skip this picture and move to how we can test it. So unfortunately, in the Google experiment, they didn't run the same circuits twice. So they obtain only one sample, usually of size 500,000, except for very large N, for every circuit. But to test this non-stationarity hypothesis, we compared the first quarter million, the sample with the first quarter million with the sample for the next quarter million, and we realized that these samples are quite distinct. So the L1 and L2 difference between the frequencies for the first half and the second half are significantly, this gap is marked here with the red line. This is significantly higher than the distribution of distances when you split this 500,000 qubits at random. And this cannot be explained by some deterioration of the fidelity, simply because the fidelity does not deteriorate in this time interval. So this non-stationarity, both aspects of the Fourier connection to noisy distribution coming from quantum computers, it will be very interesting to test them on quantum circuits, and in particular to do this experiment further for other running. Let me move now to my ninth snapshot, and this is a concept in statistics or analysis of statistical and other experiment, which is the notion of that something is too good to be true. When the experimental result fit the expectation of the researchers in a statistically unreasonable way, this is a sign of serious methodological mistake, such as biased data selection. So this is a very interesting issue. There are famous cases. One is a Mendel landmark experiment in genetics. The theory was perfectly okay, but the outcomes in various cases were much too close to too close to the expectation to be statistically reasonable. And I think in two of the cases he made there was a mistake in what to expect, and also there they were too close. And another famous example is Cyril Bert's, sorry about the mistake with Y, Cyril Bert's experiment on IQ for twins. And I should say that 20 years ago, I studied with some colleagues, Dror Bar-Natan, Brendan McCann, Maya Bar-Hillel, a case, also a statistical case where we also explored some how the data manifests some naive statistical expectation of the researchers. And this is a recent reunion that in some Zoom meetings, so Dror was in the audience, and Maya was on the slide that I presented. Brendan was not there, but I added him using Photoshop. And this is as good as we can get these days. And I should say that about 8 years after our work, we, with another group of researchers, we consider trying to make it into a theory, which Maya Bar-Hillel presented in sort of a catchy name in a 2006 presentation that you can find on my blog. And this is quite it's a subtle, delicate, and interesting issue. Now, too good to be true in the Google case. So recall that in the NISQ regime, a single error causes the circuit to fail. And the Google paper contains the following remarkable formula for a priori prediction of the fidelity. And this prediction is the product. So the quantum circuit has a lot of components, the one gate, the two gates, and then the readout error. So every qubit has some typical readout error. And there is some way, statistical way to measure for each component what is the probability that it will inflict error on the computation. And those are denoted by EG for the gates and EQ for the qubits. And the claim in the paper is that a good prediction of the fidelity is the product of 1 minus all these numbers. So you take the product over all 1 gate of 1 minus EG, and the product over 2 gates over 1 minus EG, and the product over the qubits, 1 minus EQ. And the Google paper asserts that this formula fits the experimental data up to 10 to 20%. And for this to be true, this is too good to be true, and for this to be true, it requires unrealistic statistical independence, which is very quite implausible. And it would be interesting, at least on the readout error, we studied extensively the readout error, and our work complements the work of the Google team themselves that actually computed many cases where they store the computer and then immediately measure it without a computation process. And even for the readout error, although the statistical independence is more reasonable than for the gate error, but it would be interesting to test the statistical dependence of the readout errors based on raw data that were used for their study, and we hope to do it once we will get this data. And another, let me mention a certain statistical mystery. Essentially, this is a picture you already saw, rotated by 45%. Here you can see on the x-axis, here you can see the model, the sample versus the model. So we saw a very similar picture. Here, no, not here, here. So this is certainly the picture we see here, but tilted by 45%. And when we compare the model to the data, of course, the model differs from the data, so there is some additional noise that we don't understand. Also, our readout error make only a few percent reduction for the chi-square statistic. But one thing which is a mystery is this asymmetry. The gaps in the low numbers, the gaps between the probabilities, the occurrences, and the model, the gap is asymmetric between the model and the data, and we don't have any engineering or physical explanation for this asymmetry. This is also an interesting thing to study. Okay, so let me now for my last snapshot, let me very briefly tell you the argument against quantum computer, why quantum computer cannot work. And you can read in more detail in my paper, but essentially the idea is that noisy intermediate scale quantum systems or NISQ systems represent a low-level computational ability. We already mentioned it, that they represent something which is much below a bounded computation. And that will not allow using them for demonstrating quantum supremacy or quantum advantage, or for building quantum error correction codes that are needed for quantum computation. And here's some part of the argument that I will not elaborate on, is that, which has both empirical and theoretical support, is to build quantum error correcting codes, even to build distance 5 surface code, is more difficult than to demonstrate quantum supremacy. So if the argument forbid quantum supremacy, then it will also forbid this type of quantum error correcting code. And another way to describe this argument is that if we denote 4 numbers, alpha, the rate of noise required by large quantum computers, beta, the rate of noise required for good quality quantum error correcting code. So alpha is the rate of noise required for full-scale quantum fault tolerance. Gamma, the rate of noise required to demonstrate quantum supremacy. And delta, the lowest realistic rate of noise. Then alpha is smaller than beta, smaller than gamma, smaller than delta. these numbers are not universal constant from nature. They slightly depend on the systems you study, but this inequality is generally true. And this is a consequence of this computational complexity aspect and some other things. But I should say that most people have the obvious intuition that delta is zero, that with enough engineering effort, we can push delta as low as we want, and that this analysis give reason to suspect that the delta is not. I want to mention again very briefly one aspect of the study, which is a heuristic notion which is used in this argument, and it's in general an important bridge between computational complexity and computational reality. So our main tool for the study of the complexity of algorithms are asymptotic. For example, we make a distinction between exponential running time and polynomial running time. When trying to get insight into practical questions, we need to make the assumption of naturalness, namely that the constant involved in the asymptotic description are mild. Without such an assumption, computational complexity insights hardly ever apply to real-life situations. When the assumptions of naturalness, with the assumption of naturalness, we do gain much insight. If an algorithmic task can be solved asymptotically in polynomial number of steps, then usually this suggests that the task is practicably feasible. This is not always true, but this is almost always true. There are many cases where the practical algorithm is different than the theoretical algorithm. There are cases where the practical algorithm was discovered after the theoretical or vice versa, but this is in general an important insight. And on the other hand, if a class of algorithms or computational devices represent polynomial time computation, then we cannot expect that this class of algorithms will practically solve intractable problems. And this is what we use in our case. In the NISQ case, the devices, not only that they represent polynomial time computation, represent very, very low level polynomial time computation. This is their asymptotic behavior, and this gives strong reason to doubt that you can use them to demonstrate any form of supremacy or large advantage, if we use the IBM notation. So naturalness is heuristic assertion, and it's a powerful one, and I should say it is crucial not only for my argument against quantum computers, but also for all these arguments to demonstrate quantum supremacy. They also use the very same principle. They claim that some computational task is asymptotically intractable, and they give it as a strong evidence that you will not be able to do it for 50 qubits. So perhaps the last, I promised 12 snapshots. Another very interesting aspect is consequences for physics, connection with physics. This I will not talk about today, but you can see section 5 and 8 in my paper, this paper, the argument against quantum computer and the quantum law of nature and Google supremacy. So let me conclude by saying that the question if quantum computers are possible is a clear-cut scientific question. A negative answer is a serious possibility, and it may shed light on important questions in quantum physics. This means that in this huge effort involved in quantum computer, efforts which is pivotal in deciding this question, and I should say both the IBM and Google and other who try to build quantum computers, effort which is pivotal to decide this question is important. I should say that since I regard this as a negative answer a serious possibility, but even without it, proposal for small improvement based on quantum effects should be seriously considered. Though we have exponential hopes, but there are very interesting proposals to use quantum effects for various things. And I heard a fascinating talk from the late Israeli physicist Yaron Zilberberg. I think he used quantum effects in certain improvement related to MRI or electronic microscopy. So we should not look down on small improvements using a quantum effect. This is about quantum computers. Far from being among the notable discoveries of the century, the Google supremacy, in my view, demonstration may offer some understanding of the limitations and weaknesses of technology and of scientists. And there is also a silver lining. Whether quantum computers are possible or are not possible, progress in our ability to simulate noisy quantum system is expected both ways. I should say, after I criticize Google, I should just for fairness also give a slight criticism of IBM. The same week that the news about quantum supremacy was leaked, actually, a few days before, there was a less, also amazing, but less unbelievable declaration by IBM announcing the launching of a 53-qubit computer the next month, October 2019. And as far as I know, there was announced on this month, on this October launching, but as far as I know, this launching was either didn't take place or at least was not, didn't make it to the media. So there is a lot of hopes, which is a good thing, but one have to be skeptical even about things. I must admit, I was skeptical from the beginning about the Google claim, but I was not skeptical about the IBM claim. If you announce on September that you are going to launch in October certain computer, why should I be skeptical? But even that was not realized. So let me thank you very much. And here is the logos of various agencies, institutions that I belong to, supported my research, and I should mention especially the ERC, and NSF. Okay, so this is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.